Occult Confessions is brought to you commercial-free through the generous support of our patrons. Visit occultconfessions.com and click on Donate to help keep the history of occult on the digital airwaves.
Yeah, that's good.
Of the occult.
Phantasms of the Living was written by Edmund Gurney, Frederic Myers, and Frank Podmore and published by the Society for Psychical Research in London in 1886. It was a seminal text for the field of parapsychological research. In just over 1,000 pages, spread over 2 volumes with hundreds of pages of addenda, the authors carefully laid out the case for telepathic hallucinations. By this, they meant sensory experiences or thoughts projected across a distance from one mind to another. Hallucination in this context is not a sign of malady or misapprehension, but rather an indication that these experiences are mental and don't assume an independent material or physical existence outside of the minds of the people involved. So we don't want to think about hallucination as a fantasy necessarily. Their research involved a survey of parapsychological experiments across the Western world, also a series of experiments that the authors themselves conducted, and a vast collection of narratives, mostly from citizens of the United Kingdom, from people who encountered a phantasm of the living. What is a phantasm of the living, you ask? Well, a phantasm of the living is kind of a double. Most of the experiences that these guys collected of these doubles suggest that they were generally produced when a person is in crisis or at the point of death, sort of like a near-death experience. As a person was dying or about to get into a carriage accident, for example, suddenly they would appear to a friend the next house over, or maybe even 1,000 miles away. Stories of these phantasmic encounters were carefully researched and verified as far as the authors were able to, and when verification was incomplete or impossible, they simply noted it before sharing the narrative. I say all this to let you know how serious they were about qualifying their evidence. To rule out the problem of misremembering or suggested memory, they sought out witnesses and retrieved death records and newspaper reports of accidents to verify the details they heard in the stories. Taken together, the hundreds of the reports that they received assumed a substantial weight as evidence for a phenomenon that science was at the time and continues to ignore. Today, on Occult Confessions, we consider the apparition of the dying man as a doppelganger. My name is Dr. Rob C. Thompson, joined by our Instaquisitor, Shannon Landers.
Hello.
Hello. How are things?
They're going.
You just got back from Hawaii, so you are not tan, though.
I am not
I saw you
tan.
yesterday because you don't tan.
No, I get more freckles or I turn red.
So what did you do? You sort of hid under coconut trees? Do they have coconuts in Hawaii?
Yes, but I found out that they're not native there, apparently.
Oh, non-native invasive
Yeah,
species. But you can't hide under a pineapple. They're tiny, aren't they, those plants? Can you hide?
I just hid underneath pineapple tree.
Actual pineapple? Are they trees? What is it?
No, they're bushes.
You were in Hawaii.
I didn't see them. I ate pineapple.
We're go good.
I'm pretty sure it's like a shrubbery type thing.
But not enough to hide you from the sun.
I could dig a hole underneath them and hide in the hole, I guess.
I'd like to introduce again Anna Pavon back on the scene.
Hello. Pineapples are small plants. They are not trees.
You see, Anna's a vegetarian, so she knows all about fruits.
Vegan. However, I just Googled it.
Vegan or pineapple?
Pineapple.
So Anna is untitled. However, I want to thank Brian on our Discord for suggesting a title for Anna, which I liked quite a bit. And we'll see if it grabs Anna when I announce it. Suppose, Anna, that your official name as an alchemical actor is the originator of the origin.
Ooh. Oh, is this from
sex worship?
This is from sex worship.
You don't even remember where it comes from.
Originator of the origin. I kind of like that. Honestly, yeah. I'm not against it, Brian.
It's a little meta. There you go, Brian. All right, I think that's a keeper, Brian. So Anna, you have been officially titled. I will insert a sound effect there.
Shout out to Brian.
2 thumbs
Anna
up.
just barely remember the origin of your originator of the origin, and yet it has been adopted. Shall we pledge it out? We, the members of the Secret Order of Alchemical Actors, do solemnly commit ourselves to a full and honest telling of the history of the occult as far as we know it.
I'm sorry. It sounded so weird.
I got like 50% of that, I think.
Yeah, you too. We'll just accept that as having been accomplished. All right, here's another thing. Boy, oh boy, we're off to such a good start. Now I need, let's say, Shannon to open the order of confessors. Now you simply do this by making a sound, any sound. Go. Bloop. Oh, that was nice. There you go. You're back on the horse. We want to welcome a couple of patrons this day, and I also want to let you know that we're a bit behind on patrons. Our episode recording got a little out of whack, so we are going to get caught up with all of our patrons next week. If you have not heard your name yet, probably it will happen then. We want to welcome Angel T and Nathan W, and welcome back Slump, who was not Slump before but is now Slump.
Yay! Welcome back.
Hooray. Speaking of Patreon, Luke, our Discord man, I don't know, he has a title, Producia Discordia, there it is. Luke and I did a bonus episode that was based on we guested on the Black Mass Appeal podcast last month, or maybe 2 months ago now. And then we went ahead and did a full bonus episode covering some of the material that I touched on in that episode, but going deep into the origins of Lucifer and the Garden of Eden and original sin and all those lovely things.
That's very cool.
Yeah. So all of our patrons get to enjoy that. You can join for any dollar amount, and you have access to our main bonus episodes. Then as the dollar amounts go up, we have more treats for you. But I encourage everyone to check out Patreon, check out YouTube. We've been releasing new material over there on YouTube as well. So if you haven't popped on over to YouTube, or if you just want to listen to the podcast on YouTube, if you're going through the back catalog, Dan has been posting those up for everybody to enjoy. And that's enough plugging. That's enough confessing for the day. Shannon, another sound, please. All right, that is the sound of Shannon sliding underneath a pineapple shrub. All right, are we ready for these phantasms, ladies?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
All right, let's start with the way this project is laid out. And I have been wanting to talk about these books for ages because I don't have time to read things for fun unless I'm doing it for the podcast these days. Two kids, man. So, and, I do have to produce 25 episodes on it every year, so there's not a whole lot of time for, just dicking around.
Rob.
Yes?
You do great.
That's why you're here. That's why you're the originator. So, the argument made by our man Myers, Podmore, and Gurney is spread over 2 volumes, and that argument is in a few parts. We're going to go through 1, 2, 3 here. Number 1, telepathy is a fact of nature. All right?
Okay.
Number 2, phantasms of persons undergoing some crisis occur with a frequency which mere chance cannot explain. You accept both of those things so far? I mean, I'm going to prove them to you, but...
Yeah, actually I do.
So, X plus Y, telepathy plus phantasms equals... These phantasms, whatever else they may be, are an instance of the supersensory action of one mind on another. So they're saying these phantasms, they happen, they cannot be explained, but telepathy is real. Therefore, these phantasms are a symptom of telepathy.
And it's because of a frequency?
Well, I don't know if we're going to get into too much explanation so much as just proving that these things are true.
Okay.
But, I mean, we can interpret as we go on it. You're welcome to.
Okay. I am. In my brain.
feel free. In his introduction to the 2 volumes, Myers lays out the case for why the book focuses on apparitions of the living rather than those of the dead, despite the fact that hauntings and ghost sightings were also fairly common, particularly at seances in the late 19th century, and let's be honest, right up to today. Apparitions of the living are easier to prove than apparitions of the dead because, now this is not too much of a head-scratcher, there is a living person to give evidence as to whether these accounts are veridical or not. Okay, now, wait a second, Rob. Wait. I was following you, yeah, obviously, but veridical, what the hell do you mean by that? By veridical, Frederic Myers means that there are real-world correlations to the subjective experience of the person seeing or sensing the apparition. All right? So let me see if I can do an example. Let's say Shannon, she thinks there is a ghost in her room. All right, she calls us up on it. She's like, hey, you guys. There's a ghost. What's the ghost like, Shannon?
Very tall, but has a kind smile.
Casper, the friendly ghost, but in giant form.
Abraham Lincoln, the friendly ghost.
Yeah.
So, Abe Lincoln, the friendly ghost, is visiting me, Rob. Okay. And Anna's like, well, yeah, Shannon, sometimes she hits those White Claws too hard. Maybe she's just hallucinating. But Shannon's like, but wait, I have taken a photograph of the top hat that Abe Lincoln's ghost left on my desk. That's veridical proof.
Like physical evidence that it was there.
Some kind of evidence, yeah, to back up the claim, because we can't be sure of anything that happens in anybody's head. I say this in class, and it always upsets my students, but we can't trust anybody. Ultimately, if we're really being serious about this, I can't take your word for it on anything. I need something to back it up, and that's what veridical phenomena is.
That is true. You know what I'm imagining right now? Have
What?
you ever seen Invisible Dad?
No. What is that?
It's this dad he becomes invisible, and he
Isn't
wears
that just Mrs. Doubtfire?
No. Invisible Dad and Mrs. He's not invisible. He turns into their
In
nanny.
a way.
He's disguised. That's
Okay.
disguised. But
All right,
Invisible
so-
Dad has on like sunglasses and a hat. So it's just floating sunglasses and a hat. And I just imagine like Abraham Lincoln ghost, but a top hat's just floating around.
Is he wearing sunnies? He wears sunglasses.
I have a question. So, taking a picture of the hat, does that mean that hat is physically there? Or is it did
Possibly.
Abe come and brought his hat and left it, and now the hat is there as a physical thing?
As an investigator, I would accept either one. Now, of course, if Abe manages to leave his hat and you have some evidence that it, materialized out of thin air, that's really cool. I would also accept the photograph as evidence, even if the hat dematerializes, right? Because that is a physical piece of evidence. You can show it to us, and it's objective. It's outside of you. I'm not relying just on what's in your head.
Oh, okay.
Theoretically, I could also, rely on, I don't know, Anna, if she wasn't with you. Let's say, a house over, Anna was aware of the same ghost, and you both gave me this report knowing nothing of the other's report. So there was an opportunity for you to taint each other's accounts. So there's a veridicality to that as well. If I can get intersubjectivity is really what that's called, meaning that multiple people are reporting the same thing separately and independently of each other, that starts to take on the quality of evidence too.
Okay, and this is the same ghost, so it'd be multiple people seeing the same ghost at the same time.
But you can't be aware of each other because then you're going to taint each other's experience and you're going to influence each other. Then we get into kind of like group or dual hallucinations, which are very common. You could get, like a couple who convince themselves that they're being stalked or, we all know those couples that are, a little off. They're both a little off in the same way. That's people essentially, like you can talk each other into stuff if you're in a, certain kind of relationship. Or, as the leader of the alchemical actors, because I'm a kind of a, Svengali-like guru, I could persuade all of you all sorts of crazy things. I just don't use my powers for evil.
Right.
That would also be a group hallucination, though. You see what I mean? That happens with cults. I'm making a joke, but that does happen with cults.
No, yeah.
You could all be like, well, yeah, I totally saw Rob levitate. That's just a group hallucination.
Rob, you weren't supposed to tell anybody about that. Ha ha ha.
We're what you call it, recruiting this way. So what were we talking about? Veridical phenomena. So Myers is careful to say that telepathy and not some sort of ghostly materialization is the best explanation for these doubles. So he's not really claiming my hat example. He's saying that's too far, Rob. We're not going to really see a lot of that in all this. In fact, that's not the best way to explain it. It's really telepathy. It's really one mind projecting an image to another mind. It's not an actual thing appearing in the room. But he can prove it veridically. You got the difference there?
I believe so.
So it's worth taking the time here because nothing that we explain going forward will make much sense if we don't get these basic principles. So I need to step back from my veridicality insofar as, our example with Shannon was about finding some kind of evidence. But like I said, that evidence need not always be physical. In Myers' case, he does not believe that any of the experiences that any of the people we're going to talk about here today involved a materialization, a physical materialization in space. He believes that he can prove that there is veridicality, that there is some evidence that these are true that go outside of the person's own mind. Yeah? But what they're experiencing is in fact a mental phenomenon of one mind projecting an image to another and not something actually appearing in the room. So he can prove it as if it is material in the room, but it's not ever going to go that far.
That's interesting because it seems like the only people that would understand that it's true were the two people connecting, I guess. Like if there's nothing... So is it just like a feeling that they're both sharing? Like the two people communicating?
It is. And then what Myers and his team are able to do is go out and find evidence that sort of triangulates those experiences and independently verifies that what happened to them is authentic.
Cool.
It's not in the form of a materialized body or hat or any of the things that we talked about initially with Abraham Lincoln's ghost, but he can prove it. Myers can prove it without having that stuff. So he's saying, I'm going to give you veridicality that's as good as Abraham Lincoln's hat materializing in the room. But I don't need that hat. In fact, that hat is not actually what's happening. There is no materializing happening, but I can still prove it as if it's that good. You got me?
Got it.
You good, Anna?
Is it one person's brain?
It's my brain. Like, imagine the two of us. Like, tonight, I'm like, okay, I'm going to send Anna a message before I go to bed tonight. And
projecting.
Right. Without, I don't text you. I don't call you. Mm-hmm. Just as you're going down for, going to bed, the two of us are going to sync up, and I'm going to let you see.
Just get a little download.
I'll give you a little download. Whatever my guru thoughts are for the night.
And then he proves it.
He can prove it with evidence outside of those two people.
And you haven't told us that yet, have you?
Well, we're going to do that next. Oh. So the question now is how, right? Rob, okay, that's impressive, but how does he do this? So we got to get into specific cases. He does it in part through just a preponderance of the evidence. He collects so many cases that it's difficult to disprove all of them, but let's get into it. Even though the phantasms often appear at the point of death, they also appear in cases where a person is near death but survives. In this case, the body would not have necessarily given up the ghost, so to speak. So there it goes against the materializing spirit idea. To the argument that a dead mind cannot communicate telepathically, Myers argues that death is a process of dissolution, and so the phantom proximate to death allows for the possible prolongation of some form of psychic energy through the death process, even if the heart has stopped. That's what he's willing to admit so far.
Okay.
So he's not suggesting that your immortal soul is necessarily going on a journey, although it kind of eventually amounts to that.
That's kind of what I got from that, though. That's kind of what it sounded like he was saying.
Your mind can psychically influence another mind at a distance, particularly on the verge of death or in a traumatic experience. All this having been said, Frederic Myers himself is not entirely sold on the idea that telepathy fully explains everything that we're about to talk about. It is possible, he says, that telepathy does not fully encompass the cause of all of these phenomena. On one hand, it is ill-advised to multiply causes, given that telepathy can reasonably account for these phenomena. So, in other words, this is just a basic, logic situation. If we can explain something with one cause, Anna wakes up in the morning and there's a dead frog next to her bed. If I say, well, if we look, the window's open and look down there, there's a bunch of, like frogs murdering each other down there. Oh, okay. But if Anna's like, well, Rob, actually, I have an ex-boyfriend who has a serious issue with me, and he used to call me a frog, and so what he did was murder a frog and then crawl up through my window. It's the conspiracy theory argument. If it gets too complicated, then logically it's less likely. Multiply causes. On the other hand, telepathy may only be one feature of a much larger principle involving relations between minds and may probably be more complex than those which involve even the highest known forms of matter. So what he's really saying here is not that he's going to multiply causes. It's not going to be that, Anna's ex-boyfriend comes to the pond, gets a dead frog, murders it again, climbs up through the window. He's saying that dead frog is a symptom of a much larger thing that's going on in the world. There is a mass, a frog Armageddon happening across the globe that we're missing. We don't have sight of.
So dead frogs then appear to me because
of the Armageddon that's happening. That's the thing we're missing. So
okay,
you're going,
I
mean, we're playing with frogs here, but to take the metaphor on home, that telepathic experience is real, and telepathy explains it. But telepathy itself isn't a full explanation of whatever it is that causes telepathy. There's still some missing cause behind telepathy. Another way to think about it,
a symptom to what's going on. What's really going on?
Yeah. Well, yeah, or like an instance of it. It's one example of things that can happen.
Okay.
Like heat can do many different things, right? Or heat can explain many different phenomena.
Okay, it's like a bifactor of... Is that the correct word to use?
We'll take it.
That's the one that popped up into my head.
Okay, so let's get into this a little bit now. Let's get into the text. The bulk of the text is written by Edmund Gurney, the SPR's first full-time psychical researcher and co-founder of the Society with Myers and Henry Sidgwick. He studied classics and physics and was briefly a medical and law student. Like Myers, Edmund Gurney was a proto-psychologist, that is to say a pioneer in a relatively new field, because psychology really wasn't invented, or was being invented at the end of the 19th century. An avid fan of music, he wrote about the psychology and philosophy of sound in his book The Power of Sound. He performed pioneering work with the SPR on hypnotism and hallucination and inspired the work of William James and Theodore Flournoy, but his lack of an official university affiliation has, by and large, kept him out of histories of the discipline. Gurney was not especially enthusiastic about matters of spirituality, believing that a creator god didn't deserve worship if that god had also allowed for the existence of suffering, especially if there was no afterlife to look forward to. So he's not big on religion, is what I'm trying to say here.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. But Myers and Sidgwick persuaded him to join them in their parapsychological investigations after Gurney lost 3 of his sisters who drowned in a boating accident on the Nile. Whoa.
Oh.
Yeah. While their death motivated Gurney, he remained skeptical of spiritualist mediums and claims about the human survival of bodily death up to his own demise. Gurney lived a relatively short life. He was born in 1847 and died in 1888 at the age of 41 of an overdose of chloroform. While suicide can't be ruled out, particularly since he was known to have bouts of mania and melancholy, the death was likely accidental since Gurney used chloroform to treat facial pain caused by neuralgia. What a character, right?
Yeah, that's... Jeez.
Gurney is very careful in Phantasms not to jump... Okay, before I get into... We'll get into the text, but the main thing I want to focus on here is Gurney is not... he's not an Arthur Conan Doyle. He's not looking for evidence of the paranormal with a bias toward the paranormal. His bias is really against the paranormal. Yes, his sisters died, but even though they died, the fact that they died is the reason he even attempted this. He was really reluctant to even give a crap about any of this. But they died, and he was like, okay, fine, I'll give it a shot. Gurney is very careful in Phantasms not to jump to any erroneous conclusions. He stays as close to the evidence as possible, drawing only the most likely explanation for phenomena in question, namely telepathic hallucinations. Telepathy is when the mind of an agent impresses the mind of a percipient. The agent sends the impression, and the percipient receives it. Mesmerism was the first modern phenomenon to demonstrate thought transference, namely between the mesmerizer and the so-called somnambulist, or the person in the trance. This association with mesmerism actually damaged thought transference as a subject for scientific investigation, since science or academic psychology tended to reject mesmerism as a benighted and foolish practice of the past. This is important. I mean, really, psychology owes its existence in large part to mesmerism, which introduced people to the idea that there was a subconscious and that the subconscious could do wacky stuff. But the fact that mesmerists did things like thought transference, and all sorts of other, like diagnose diseases and all these sort of cool things, psychology, when it was born, was like, oh yeah, we're not those guys at all. You know what I mean?
But that's like how they formed psychology, was off of that.
Yeah, it's sort of like, your mother gives birth to you and then, she
She's
tries
like,
to hang out with
I
you.
am not that at all.
Well, you are. Yeah, you're like that. Yeah. Mesmerism, birth psychology, you take your mom to your party or whatever, and you're 15 and your mom just wants to like hang out with your friends. You're like, ew, mom, I don't know her. That's essentially how psychology felt about mesmerism.
Oh.
Not cool. Mesmerism. Shannon's just reflecting on how bizarre this is as a metaphor.
Not cool psychology.
Not cool. Come on, that was your mom. She was in labor for like 18 hours with you. She pooped herself. It was a mess. Mesmerism included cases that demonstrated possible telepathic communication, but it also allowed for alternate explanations through unconscious perception. Some cases of thought transference were actually a product of the percipient reading the approval or disapproval of the agent through unconscious muscular movement or even the sound of their footsteps. So this is the idea that some people are very sensitive, I guess, perceptive of physical signs. They're not really using their minds. You got me?
Yeah, their body's reacting.
Yeah, if you could see me, then you could just read my body signals. You might even not be aware that you can do it, but, on an unconscious level, you can read my facial tics or whatever. Often, early mesmeric impressions were transferred through physical contact, which opened up the possibility of involuntary muscular action communicating some impression rather than the mind working directly on another mind. So if I hold your hand, I might be able to get some sense of how you're feeling. But then experimenters discovered that the percipient could discern objects thought of by the agent, just thought of, and began to try working without direct physical contact and with the mesmerizer still. So now we're starting to work toward better experimental conditions. Don't want to be able to see the person, don't want to be able to hear the person, don't want to be able to touch the person, because unconscious impressions could all be sent that way. Perfect situation, you're in two different rooms sending messages. Among the first to experiment with telepathy outside of the context of mesmerism was the Creary family. That's Creery, the Crearys. Reverend A.M. Creary conducted regular experiments in his home with his daughters and a young maidservant. He sent one of the girls out of the room and selected an object in the room which the girl was to name when she returned. Over time, the girls got very good at guessing these objects, and so Creary moved on to names of towns, people, dates. He would have them pick cards out of a pack and even have them name lines of poetry, with the company of agents choosing the line or card before the percipient entered the room. So you go out of the room, they would pick a line of poetry, you'd have to come back in and tell me what that line is.
It sounds to me like it's just like strengthening intuition or something. It's like very heightened intuition.
Pretty intense, though. I don't know how you could send signals like how would your intuition tell you what line of poetry I'm thinking of?
I don't know, but that's what it sounds like to me, like just a gut feeling or intuition.
It's
because it's automatic,
a kind of
right?
muscle. Yeah, you would just walk in and whatever psychic impression, you would give me that line of poetry. Henry Sidgwick, W.F. Barrett, and Frederic Myers came to test the girls themselves and generally were pleased with the results, or at least they found they were positive. The Creary case, as with many early instances of parapsychological research, is not without controversy. Gurney later found out that the girls had developed a coded system for cheating at naming cards with different gestures indicating suits and card values, but this was only operable when the girls acted as both agent and percipient. So you got that. So, like Shannon, you and Anna are together on this. You're both Creary sisters. Anna Creary, Shannon Creary. Shannon Creary goes out of the room, but you guys, in the night, tittering over your pillows, you were like, ooh, we're going to, when I give you this signal, that means it's a heart. When I do this, it's an 8. So, Anna comes back in. We pick the card. You were in the room with us. Who left the room again?
I think I left the room, but
we Shannon
had established cues. For what? So
Anna is in the room when we pick the card, and then you come in the room, and she just gives you the like a catcher. She just gives you the little signal, and then you can tell us what card it is, and we're amazed. But it was just codes.
So they're just big old cheaters.
Big old cheaters in that instance.
Okay.
But it only worked if one of the girls was present in the room, and they did tests where there were no girls around. In one test, the experimenter wrote down the name of an object in the adjoining room, showed it to those assembled, and the girl, who had been in a separate room the entire time, entered with the object from the adjoining room. That's kind of amazing.
Whoa.
So she didn't even come in. She couldn't have gotten a signal. They picked an object, wrote it down, and then she entered with it.
Wow.
She had to select the object before seeing the experimenter or any of the others who knew its identity. Here again, no code would have helped her, since she saw no one before she had to make her choice. The girls successfully fetched a hairbrush, an orange, a wine glass, a toasting fork. I don't know what the hell that is.
Like for marshmallows?
Yeah, I'm kind of picturing that. Yeah, like you would hold it over the fire. A cup and a saucer. Well, you could make toast that way, because they didn't have a toaster in 1880, so that might be how you made toast, on a fork.
Picture a very fancy fork to hit up against a glass to
for toasting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's going so many different ways.
They got a cup and a saucer. They brought tongs the first time. Actually, for the toasting fork, they brought tongs accidentally the first time, and then they sent them out, and they came back with the toasting fork. A cup and a saucer on the second attempt. They brought a plate on the first attempt. So listen to that. The objects are close. They're getting some kind of impression, fetching an object that looks like what they think they're seeing, and then they end up with the correct thing.
Right, they're narrowing it down, getting an idea, and then getting specific about it, and actually getting the right thing.
So
let me see if you. Yeah, go ahead.
So they're not picturing. They're seeing. So they're not actually seeing these items. They're experiencing a feeling to make them know that that's the item they're picking.
Yeah, they're getting a psychic impression and choosing because they haven't, in that other room, I wrote down on my piece of paper, you two were in the room next to me, and I picked an object, wrote it down on the piece of paper, and it's in the room with you, but you don't know what I've written on that paper because you haven't even seen me. We're in separate rooms, but you're going to enter with that object.
Cool. It's this feels like the right one. And they're right.
Yeah, you're often right, or you're close. In 495 object trials with non-family members, some of which involved only a single agent, 95 were correct guesses on the first try, and 45 on the second. Think about that.
Absolutely insane.
Yes, that's crazy. 20% of the time, they guessed a random object. Nuts. The last of these trials, the girls correctly guessed 35 out of 50 words transferred. Wow. Over time, the girls' capacity to achieve successful results dissipated, suggesting to Gurney, Myers, and Barrett that telepathic ability is sensitive and perhaps not an inborn or lifelong capacity. French researcher M. Richet performed his own card experiment with a large pool of percipients attempting to guess the correct card. So here's another example of this style of research. While the guesses were far closer to chance than the guesses of the Crearys, Edmund Gurney notes that the number of correct guesses were considerably above the number Richet would have expected to receive by pure chance. Another set of experiments involved the percipient, because chance would be 50-50. So anything deviating from 50-50, if you have a large enough number of participants, is interesting. If 55% are guessing correctly, that's why. Why would 55% be guessing correctly? It should be even 50-50. Another set of experiments involved the percipient copying a diagram drawn by an agent in a separate room. You got me? So Anna's in this room and Shannon's in the next room. There's a wall between them and the door is closed, and Shannon draws something and Anna draws the same thing. That's the test.
That's like even more so insane than the grabbing the correct object. Drawing the same thing.
And an independent auditor would have to sort of like adjudicate it, because they're not going to be identical, because you don't have the same skill, but are you basically drawing the same thing? The authors copied 16 of the 150 tests into the book to show how similar, if not identical, the drawings often were. So this is pretty good. Guthrie, Gurney, and Myers also experimented with sending sense experiences of smell and taste, asking the percipients to describe the experience the agent, generally the investigators themselves, was having. They did the smell test near a kitchen that smelled like beefsteak and onions to mask the particular sense being communicated.
What?
This is so weird. They're trying to do psychic smell tests. Can you guess what I'm smelling? But they did it near a kitchen where there was so much onion and beefsteak that was all anyone could smell. And then I would go into my little like closet and smell something else other than onion and beefsteak, and you'd have to guess what I was smelling in my closet.
While smelling onion and beefsteak.
Isn't that bizarre? They did a taste test, and the percipients were in a separate room and had to guess what the experimenters were tasting as they tasted it. For touch,
onion and beefsteak.
Mostly that, yeah. It was either onion or beefsteak. You had a 50-50 shot. For touch, the percipient sat blindfolded with his or her back to a crew of agents who all inflicted pain on the same part of the body at once. In this case, 10 out of 20 were reasonably accurate. So I'm in one room poking Anna with needles, and Shannon's like, my arm, my foot, my knee, my butt. Got me?
Voodoo.
Yeah, a little bit. It's a little voodoo-y, yeah. They also experimented with unconscious impressions. A hypnotized subject, first Sidney Beard and then a boy named Fernley, unknown to the hypnotist, was to receive the answer yes or no from an agent. The agent was the hypnotist G.A. Smith. He had a list of 12 responses, yes or no, written out in order. Yes, yes, no, no, yes, no, yes, 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 and so on. 12 predetermined binary responses, yes or no. Got me? Yes?
Oh, yes.
Okay. The experimenters struck a tuning fork and then, not a toasting fork, and asked the hypnotized man if he heard it. Each time, his answer was supposed to correspond to the answer on the list. The percipient wasn't trying to guess the correct answer, but responding intuitively from a subconscious state. They tried this experiment with agent and percipient 6 feet apart, 12 feet apart, 17 feet apart, and the agent then finally in another room. They also tried it by shuffling the answers yes or no in a card deck so that they were only known at the moment of transmission. Out of 43 tries with Fernley, every single response was correct.
No. Shut the fuck up.
Yes. Everyone, 43 times, he guessed correctly whether the answer was yes or no.
In a hypnotic state, right?
Yes. Yep. Straight in a row.
That's crazy. What?
Outside of an experimental context, the circumstances became more difficult to credit, and so Gurney acknowledged the kinds of errors he and Podmore and Myers must control for. First are the errors of observation. Somebody sees something, and that they either misperceive or misidentify. For example, someone reports seeing a neighbor pass by the window and misidentifies the neighbor as an apparition when it's really just Joe from across the street. So Shannon's like, oh, I just saw my great aunt Gertie walking across my window. And it's just like, the lady from the, Stop and Shop walking to her car.
It's just Brenda, Shannon.
She's Brenda. She's Brenda, man. So misidentification. This happens all the time. This is why eyewitness testimony is not swell in a court trial. You'd be like, yeah, it's sort of like that guy. Yeah, sure, that's the guy. Ah, sure, that's absolutely the man I saw. Usually, we're not that confident. Then comes the subjective errors of narration and memory. Errors in the narrative are when someone tells something that isn't necessarily a lie, but is more like an embellishment based on the person's biases. Memory is a more difficult problem because if the narrator misremembers, they do so honestly and often without exaggeration, so it's more difficult to discern the truth of the matter. Someone might imagine details that weren't there in an effort to complete the story or simplify the complexities in an experience. So, I don't know, like, suppose... I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example here, but we can misremember things in a variety of ways. Like if I try to remember Anna's scene that she did for me in acting class, however many years ago, I may not be able to remember all the details of what she was wearing or how long the scene was or what grade she got, but because I like Anna, I might say, oh, she got a perfect score. Maybe she got a 48 out of 50. You see what I mean?
It was Spring's Awakening. I was wearing a black dress. We forgot some of our lines and we did get a perfect score. So.
There it is for the record. So to obtain the best possible evidence, the investigators collect the experience from the agent, if alive, and the percipient with a special focus on the percipient. Their focus is on a first-hand account as the best possible evidence. So they don't want, well, I heard that Joe said, we want Joe to say it directly to us. Both the agent's and the percipient's experiences must be simultaneous. In other words, the percipient must receive the impression at the same time the agent is sending it. Ideally, the percipient would have had their experience before knowing its cause in the agent. For example, if I saw an apparition of a dying person without knowing they were even sick, this would be more persuasive than my imagination conjuring such an image because I know already that they are dying. Right?
Oh, yeah. I read a book one time where this person... Is now a good time to insert story?
Insert story here.
Just short. I read a book one time where this guy had that happen. And he was like, hey, Grandma, you're sick. Like, you have cancer. And then she went to the doctor, and she did.
Well, that's pretty psychic.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, he knew.
Yeah.
That's pretty psychic, yeah. But we will be more persuaded. In that instance, does that work? Yeah, that works pretty well, because he didn't know. He didn't have any independent knowledge of Grandma being sick, right?
No.
Theoretically, he could have read some physical
he was
signs,
he was like a kid.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah.
So it could be psychic. It could be he's reading signs about Grandma. Maybe something's a little off. He doesn't know.
Yeah, well, in his book, like
but...
he claims himself to be psychic, which is, in my eyes, true because that happened.
So he's got a narrative to sell there for sure.
Exactly.
In a perfect world, we know nothing about what's happening with Grandma, and suddenly we see her. Or even better yet, because we might assume that Grandma, she's old, she might die soon. Our brother or sister or something, we would have a sudden vision of, and not even know that there's anything wrong with them. That's impressive. Also, there should be some witness or documentation to the recipient's experience as an independent validation to rule out a false memory. This is when we get back to Abraham Lincoln's hat and veridical phenomena. Again, Myers is not looking for an actual ghost to materialize in the room or any evidence that happened because these independent witnesses and documentation are doing the work of providing veridical proof without having to have a materialization. Here we go. Under these conditions, the volume of cases the authors collected creates a situation in which some form of telepathic contact is the best and simplest possible explanation for all the evidence, as opposed to the myriad alternative hypotheses that might be developed for each individual case. Sort of an Occam's razor situation, which, science-minded folks often use against paranormal claims. But when we get down to all this evidence, Occam's razor falls on the side of the paranormal, because to provide a physical explanation for these events requires you to go to extremely bizarre lengths. Period.
It's not your everyday activity.
No, this is not an everyday event. Rare recurrence, but they've collected hundreds of examples of it happening to different people. What was it, Shannon?
So I was just curious, before they performed these experiences, would they do some sort of like meditation before? Or were they just going to separate rooms like, I'm going to pick this? Or like, would they focus their energy?
If we're talking about their examples of telepathy, Anna's right that they sort of like worked out the muscle. In the case of the Creary family, they just kept doing it over and over again, and I do think they got better at it, like developing a muscle.
Okay, but there wasn't like meditation like involved.
It's possible. There could be some focusing activity. It really would vary by person depending on what they think they need. We sort of develop rituals around it, but all the cases that we're about to talk about going forward from this moment on are sort of out of the blue. No one has done any preparation.
Interesting.
It's unexpected that this would happen. It strikes them as a surprise. So they aren't trying to reach out for a psychic impression. No one's trying to really send them a psychic impression necessarily, and yet it happens. Telepathy becomes the easiest rationale in these cases for the hundreds of cases listed, even though this one might be accounted for by false memory or that one by, sewer gas, hallucination. Telepathy can explain all of the cases, whereas sewer gas can only explain one or two, right? So, you got me? So, if we have 500 cases sitting in front of us, or even 100 cases, and in one case the guy was just like smelling sewer gas and he started to see things, and that's not going to be the case for the other 99, because we're not going to be able to prove that sewer gas is present in the home in all those cases. Furthermore, for the cases that they include in their study, alternate explanations are always far more improbable than the telepathic explanation. We're going to start to multiply causes to try to explain what's happening when we can just say it's telepathy. The classes of thought transference, or cases of thought transference, include the transmission of pain, emotion, or idea, like the fact that a ship has arrived safely in a port. Also dreams or externalized impressions, which include visual apparitions. These impressions often form gradually in the mind of the percipient. A figure may, for example, only be identified after it has been perceived, or it may gradually take shape, or the experience may take place in stages. This last version, in which an unidentified impression becomes more perceptible, is the most common. So Anna might see in her room sort of like a cloudy figure, or she catches something out of the corner of her eye, and if she allows herself to focus on it, gradually she begins to see a face, and then the final phase of this, she can recognize the face. But that impression came long before she recognized someone she knew. You following me?
Mm-hmm. So it's like my brain would have been doing that.
You're trying to figure out who it is. Yeah.
Trying to figure it out, so I'm like connecting it to people that I know.
Yes, yeah. But at first it was a very hazy, unidentified. Right.
So this wouldn't happen if it was I wouldn't be seeing a stranger, for instance.
It's possible. It could happen. We'll get into some of the cases, but more often than not, it's someone that you know.
Okay.
But you just didn't know it was someone you knew when you first sensed the presence.
So
I was just like,
the presence is sorry. So the presence is there first, and then your body starts to figure out what it is.
Mind and body, yeah. Yeah, you're trying to put together what you're looking at. In experimental conditions, telepathic reception is best achieved when the percipient's thoughts are wandering at random, and not when they are concentrating hard on receiving the impression. This is something that we work on in class, even as artists. I constantly tell my students that they need to let their minds go. They need to stop trying so hard and let the subconscious do its work. This is true of psychics and of psychic impression. The impression is communicated first to the higher mind, where ideas are formed, and is then promulgated downward to the rest of the brain, where it is fleshed out. This is how Myers and Gurney are attempting to explain why you don't know who it is at first. You get the impression first, and then you have to figure it out. If you're actively trying to focus and concentrate, then you're not actually going to be able to receive the impression.
So it kind of does sound like what Shannon was saying, like maybe not necessarily a meditation before, but the act of doing it is kind of a meditation in itself.
You would have to be in a sort of wandering state of mind to experience this. Going to bed, or just sort of like drifting off, something like that, or just sitting looking at looking out the window. I don't know. You don't want to be actively trying to think through something.
Right, but isn't that kind of what meditation is?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, this is less likely to happen these days because people are always on their phones.
This is true, yeah.
Keeping your mind busy and and doing rather than wandering. You're not daydreaming.
Gotcha.
Emotionally charged impressions are, in the author's opinion, most likely to develop into full hallucinations. So the more strongly we feel about it, the stronger the hallucination becomes. And by hallucination, again, they mean possible paranormal event, not just a psychological aberration. Since these telepathic impressions don't often come fully formed, according to the agent's intended communication, they are filtered through the percipient's own consciousness, which can add its own atmosphere and imagery. Since these telepathic impressions don't often come fully formed, according to the agent's intended communication, they are filtered through the percipient's own consciousness, which can add its own atmosphere and imagery. The influence of the percipient's beliefs and ideas does not refute the telepathic communication, but rather reflects the joint action of agent and percipient in forming the hallucination. So, I send Anna images of, me levitating, but Anna is really hungry while I'm sending those images, and she sees me just like holding a big bowl of, what do you want, Anna?
Like maybe some ice cream, but like
ice cream.
Yeah.
Vegan ice cream.
Vegan ice cream. It's improved, people, okay? It's really not that bad. It's really not that bad anymore.
So I am sending an impression to Anna. She's seeing me communicating with her, but because of her personal experience, she's distorting that image a bit through her own subjective experience. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Technically, we do this with everything we experience in life.
I was going to say,
it. Yeah.
Kind of sounds like just the way
it's just what it is to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, for example, I don't want to talk about sex today too much, but just generally, when we go through life, whether we like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not in #MeToo world, we know the people we would bang or not, whether it's appropriate or not. We have what's called the sexual bearing toward all other people. And that colors the way we interact with them, whether we know it or not.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like a primal thing. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a film through which or a filter through which we encounter reality. But in the case of psychic impressions, it has a stronger influence, I think.
I'm sorry,
Shannon giggling over there.
No, I'm just laughing. It's like
had to insert sex somewhere, Rob.
I'm here for it.
So like, if you're like sexually attracted to someone, they appear, but like they're like in a silk robe.
I appear to Anna covered in silks and bearing ice cream.
Smoking a cigar.
Ooh, gross. I guess that's a phallic symbol. Whatever does it for you.
Yeah, for some people, it's like an aphrodisiac because of.
Oh no, yeah. I just thought smoking cigars and wearing silk went hand in hand.
Eating oysters.
And ice cream, all at once. Vegan oysters and vegan ice cream, of course.
Sounds horrifying.
I don't know if they've invented those yet, vegan oysters. They got chicken nuggets and all that.
Oh, the chicken nugget. Let me tell you something. The chicken nuggets are so good.
Oh, you're with them. Okay. You're there for the chicken nuggets.
I'm there for the occasional chicken nugget.
What the hell was I talking about? Telepathic hallucinations could also include information the percipient could have only had by supernatural means, confirmed as a veridical phenomenon from the agent. For example, if the percipient encounters a phantasm whose hair is a different color than they remember because the hair has actually changed color, or if they perceive an apparition of a person who has died, unaware that any death has taken place. So I could say, I'm seeing Anna, but... she's all wet. Maybe it's because you drowned in the pool.
I drowned, yeah.
Yeah. It would take us weeks to go through all the cases discussed in these 2 volumes. We're not going to do that, so I want to focus on the 2 varieties that Gurney, Myers, and Podmore conclude their book with. These, in my opinion, are the most interesting and the most persuasive: reciprocal and collective cases. Those are the 2 ones we're going to do now. If you want the rest of the cases, these books are for free on the internet. You can knock yourself out.
Set
aside. You got to set aside a few months of your life, but knock yourself out. Yeah, link it? What does that mean? You'd send us pictures of yourself? What are we going to do?
No,
you
just
click
link
the link.
You, Rob. Yeah. Link it in the bio of the book.
If you would like to live stream yourself reading the book for several months, though, we'll link it.
So. We won't link the book, but we'll link you reading the book.
We'll link you reading the book, yeah. Yeah, so let's do the reciprocal and the collective cases.
Just
start with reciprocal.
To yourself, not even out loud.
No, not out loud. Of course, not out loud. It's just you reading.
I'm sorry.
You get an extra free episode for that.
Sorry, we moved on. I brought it back. I didn't need to do that, so I'm sorry.
I wasn't going to scold you. Reciprocal cases are those in which both the agent and the percipient report receiving information they could not have had by any other than telepathic means. Collective cases are those in which multiple percipients receive the information projected by an agent. Reciprocal first. One such reciprocal report comes from Cromwell F. Varley, given to a committee of the Dialectical Society in 1869. Varley and his wife were on their way to visit his sister-in-law, who was near the point of death due to a heart condition, in the night. Varley had a vision of his sister-in-law in the room. Little did Varley know that he was suffering from a physical ailment that nearly killed him that night, but for this nocturnal visit.
She said, "If you do not move, you will die." But I could not move. And she said, "If you submit yourself to me, I will frighten you, and you will then be able to move." When at last I consented, my heart had ceased beating. I think at first her efforts to terrify me did not succeed, but when she suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, Cromwell, I am dying!" that frightened me exceedingly, and threw me out of the torpid state, and I awoke in the ordinary way.
By ordinary way, he means shouting and screaming and waking his wife. The next day, they met the sister-in-law, who explained that she'd been greatly troubled about Varley's health and had psychically visited Varley's and his wife's room around 3:30 in the morning, seeing that Varley was in danger. Only by claiming that she herself was dying had she been able to wake him. So the sister shouted at him, "I'm dying," and he was like, "Oh, I better wake up." She wasn't dying, she was lying, she was just trying to get him out of bed so his heart wouldn't stop.
So she did it.
Yeah, she saved him.
She was like, she purposefully did it with her psychic abilities. Holy shit.
This case, while amazing, only skirts the category of reciprocal telepathic thought. Gurney suggests that it's possible the sister-in-law's dream could have been the only telepathic communication in this instance, which then shaped the dream of Varley, both of them dreaming each other. The case of Mrs. T.W. Smith, addressed to the SPR in 1876, is more difficult to reduce down to a single communication. Mrs. Smith had a strange recurring dream reported by her husband.
My wife dreamt that she was in a well-remembered room at the base of the building in company with 4 females, 2 of whom were old friends and 2 strangers to her. They were talking and laughing and preparing to retire to their several sleeping apartments. She saw one of them turn off the gas. She followed them upstairs, entered with 2 of them into a bedroom, saw Bessie place some things in a box, undress, and get into bed. Then she went to her, took her by the hand, and said, "Bessie, let us be friends."
When Mrs. Smith went to visit her mother, she received a strange letter from an old friend asking to know whether she was dead or alive. This friend knew Bessie, and one night, as Bessie was going to bed, Bessie had cried out because she'd seen Mrs. Smith beside her saying, "Let us be friends." The 2 women decided that the apparition meant Mrs. Smith might be dead, and so they wrote the letter. "Mrs. Smith, are you dead?" Mrs. Smith turned out to be alive and well, and perplexed that she had been dreaming the same thing Bessie had. Got me?
Got some goosebumps.
Yeah. Both of them were dreaming separately. Same thing. In 1883, Mrs. Park of Elm Park. Sorry. Let me do that. No. Elm Park Gardens. Mrs. Park of Elm Park Gardens. Very British name in a very British place, reported a story in which her husband was being treated by a mesmerist, Mr. L. One day, as her husband was sitting in the garden, Mrs. Park saw from a distance that her husband was talking with a man in a peculiar hat and cape. When her husband came in, she asked about the man, and he told her he'd been talking to no one. He'd been alone the whole time he was outside. I'm going to quote Park here. 2 days afterwards, Mr. L., after giving my husband his treatment, came, as was his usual habit, to speak to me before leaving the house. After a few words, he said, "It is odd, but the same experience has happened to me twice since I have attended your husband, that when in quite another place I have suddenly felt as if I were standing by his side, either in your drawing room or out there in the garden." As Mr. L. was sharing this strange experience with Mrs. Park, she noticed his hat and cape were identical to the ones that the man she'd seen talking to her husband had been wearing. So they didn't know this beforehand, but Mrs. Park had seen the man standing with her husband, and her husband was like, "There's nobody there." And the man himself had seen himself standing with her husband, even though he wasn't there. Yeah? Are you amazed?
It's like multiple dimension type of thing.
I'll try to amaze you some more. Still more amazing are the collective cases. All right, now this is really going to get you. That stuff I think is neat, it's interesting, it's weird, but the collective cases, here we go. What's challenging about these is how difficult they are to explain as instances of telepathic communication, since it must be happening simultaneously with multiple people. If more than one person is seeing the same phantasm, that tempts us to think that there must objectively be some kind of physical wraith in the room with them. But Gurney says that a material phantom is incredibly difficult to argue for, given what we know about physics. It's more likely, he says, that a telepathic hallucination is simultaneously projected from one agent to multiple people, or that the mind of one percipient may broadcast its hallucination to others. We're going to hear, that 5 people in the room or 3 people in the room saw the same ghost. So that makes us want to say that there's actually a ghost in the room. But what Gurney is saying is either the person who projected the ghost is projecting it to all 3 people, or he's projecting it to one person, he or she, or they, and that one person is then projecting it to another person, to another person. You see what I mean? So it could be like a lightning chain. They're not exactly the same thing. One person is projecting it directly to 3 people, or projecting it to one other person who's projecting it to one other person, and on and on.
So does that mean if that was the case, everyone would be seeing the same kind of like entity presence?
Yeah,
but
we would all be seeing the same thing.
But they could see like their version of it?
There might be some small variations, yeah. We don't get into that too much here in this instance, but I think it's conceivable. Cool. If you think I'm sexy, I'm in a silk robe. If you're hungry for ice cream, I'm holding ice cream. If you like cigars, I'm smoking.
Whose brain is able to do that, though? Like, project images to other people, project their visions.
Theoretically, anybody, if you're in the right state of mind. But so, psychics and sensitives are better at it.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So a practice person or someone who's naturally gifted.
Myers actually disagrees with Gurney that contagious telepathic hallucination is the best possible explanation logically, but it's as far as Gurney's willing to speculate regarding the collective phantasm, so we'll just sort of leave it there for now.
Okay.
The first case they mention is of Jeannie Gwynne Bettany and her cook, which is both a collective and a reciprocal event. Bettany had the sudden impression one night that something was wrong with her neighbor. The same night, her cook, who'd had no communication with Mrs. Bettany regarding the neighbor, had a dream that gave her the impression that the neighbor was in trouble. I'm going to quote Mrs. Bettany. "I decided to send a servant to the house to ask if all were well. The answer I received was, 'Mrs. J. died last night.' Her daughter afterwards told me that the mother had startled her by saying, 'Mrs. Bettany knows I shall die.'" So the woman on her deathbed says this.
"I decided to send a servant to the house to ask if all were well. The answer I received was, 'Mrs. J. died last night.' Her daughter afterwards told me that the mother had startled her by saying, 'Mrs. Bethany knows I shall die.' I had never felt an interest in the lady before that memorable night. After the death, the family left the neighborhood, and I've not seen any of them since."
So her cook says, "I had a dream that your neighbor's dying."
What?
first and foremost. And secondly, the dying woman says, my neighbor knows I'm going to die. Neither of them know about each other. Neither of them know, right? So the neighbor doesn't know that the cook has psychically figured out that she's dying and told the woman. You get me?
My brain's going in like 5 different directions. But I think so, yeah.
I'll walk it one more time because it is a cool thing. The cook says to the woman, your neighbor is dying. The dying woman has no idea that that's happened in the house next door and says to her daughter, my neighbor knows I'm dying. So the dying woman doesn't know that the cook has had this psychic impression, theoretically. She has no way of knowing other than as a psychic thing. And the cook has no way of knowing that the neighbor's dying. And yet both know these things. She knows that the
cook knows that she is dying.
There you go.
Does the woman know that she is dying?
Yeah, I think the woman she's in bad shape.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The investigator received both Bettany's report and her cook's account of her dream independently that had an experience that also turned out to be a reciprocal engagement with the dying woman, at least in Mrs. Bettany's case. Georgiana Paulson told of seeing a cousin, Caroline, pass by her on the stairs dressed all in black with her hands crossed over her chest. Startled by this apparition, she ran down the steps and immediately fainted at her husband's feet. Extremely 19th century thing to do.
I was going to say.
It happens all the time. Anna's constantly fainting at people's feet.
Oh, yes.
I can't tell you how many times I picked Shannon and Anna up off the ground.
Actually, I am prone to fainting.
Really?
Fainting. Yeah, I just did it a couple weeks ago.
While you were dancing or just hanging out?
Nah, just hanging out.
Hot damn. Yeah. The next day, she learned that a girl she'd hired to clean the grates had seen the same figure and refused to re-enter the room where she'd encountered this figure, so they both experienced the same apparition. That day, Mrs. Paulson wrote to her aunt and uncle and learned that Caroline was very ill and not expected to live. Both she and the servant girl had seen the same telepathic phantasm of the cousin Caroline. Both Mr. de Guerin and his sister saw the phantasm of another sister, Fanny, appear on the same night at the same time in May 1854. Both were in China, while Fanny was thousands of miles away in England.
I gradually became aware there was something in the room. It appeared like a thin white light about the foot of the bed. Fancying it was merely the effect of a moonbeam, I took little notice. But after a few moments, I plainly distinguished a figure which I recognized as that of my sister Fanny. At first, the expression of her face was sad, but it changed to a sweet smile, and she bent her head towards me as if she recognized me. I was too much fascinated with the appearance to speak, although it did not cause me the slightest fear. The vision seemed to disappear gradually in the same manner as it came.
So I was like super convinced that he was just wrong and that it wasn't happening in their brains and that this must have been like a ghost that they were both seeing at the same time. But the fact that they're in 2 separate countries.
2 different places. Well, I mean,
2 different places.
Fanny is in England and the brother and sister are both in China, but not in the same room.
And seeing the same thing.
The siblings were not aware that Fanny was seriously ill, but she spoke of them both to those at her bedside before she died on the 30th of May, 1854. Still creepier is a case from the 17th century recorded in a man's journal. Writing in the year 1652, Philip II, Earl of Chesterfield. I know all of you keep track of the Earls of Chesterfield. This is Philip. I have the trading cards. He woke one morning while away from the home on business in London to discover a 5-foot-tall white figure with a knot on its head and a black face towering above him. The figure vanished, but it had given him a vague worry about his wife's health, and so he immediately went home to his estate. There, his servants handed him a parcel of letters as he rushed up the stairs to find his wife in good health and talking to her sister, Lady Essex, and another lady, Mrs. Ramsay.
They asked me what made me come home so much sooner than I had intended, whereupon I told them what had happened to me that morning, which they all wondering at desiring me to open and read the letter that I had taken from the footman, which I immediately did, and read my wife's letter to me aloud, wherein she desired my speedy return, as fear that some ill would happen to me, because that morning she had seen a thing all in white with a black face standing by her bedside.
two different places, they saw the exact same tall, white figure with a black face towering above them. Wife in the ancestral home, Philip on business in London, see the same thing.
My mind immediately just goes to why. Like, why is this happening?
And it's impressive because Philip had the experience, and then his wife wasn't like, oh yeah, me too. She had written it down before she talked to him. You see what I mean? So it wasn't like his experience influenced what she thought she saw. It was in writing.
Wow.
What's most convincing about these cases is the fact that the two percipients were unaware of the other's impression. Bettany and her cook had separate impressions of the dying neighbor. Paulson knew nothing of the great cleaner's experience but learned about it from her family. Both of Fanny's siblings had their experiences separately. The last case is perhaps the most perplexing because it involves no death whatsoever but a phantom that seems to have formed from no particular source, and Chesterfield's wife had recorded her experience of it before he even arrived. There are also cases of percipients seeing a phantasm simultaneously. In the interest of time, I'll share just one of these from Reverend J.N. Hoare, vicar of Keswick, who wrote in 1882 of an apparition of his mother who visited him while he was in the company of several others.
We sat into the twilight, but there was still sufficient light to recognize each other and see objects pretty clearly. A figure approached me from the side of the room occupied by the large bed, and apparently from the side of it, moved directly towards me and placed its hand on my shoulder. It was a female figure, but I could not recognize the features. I followed it to the library, but did not see it again. I returned to my companions and asked them if they'd seen it. They replied in the affirmative. I said, if there ever was a ghost, that was one.
All the people in that room saw his mother's ghost put her hand on him. Or not a ghost, she wasn't dead yet. She was still alive. She would die later. Myers appends an essay to the volume in which he questioned Gurney's conclusions about these collective cases. Myers said, there was no clear evidence that hallucinations as such could be transmitted between individuals. He argued that in addition to the mind possessing subconscious operations, there are also superconscious operations which transcend the limits of the ordinary. Subconscious thought exists below the threshold of consciousness, and superconscious thought resides above that threshold. You got me? We have your ordinary consciousness right now. Is this what you're looking for, Anna?
Yep, sure is.
Here we are. You're conscious of me talking, and, we're having a time, and, you got your room and your wall and whatever you're looking at. That's your consciousness. Subconscious thought is below that. So that's, your repressed desire for your cousin and stuff. That's all, your repressed desire for vegan ice cream, or in Anna's case, actual ice cream, is like jammed down into the subconscious.
Okay.
The superconscious is up above that.
Okay.
So it's not those jammed down, repressed subconscious feelings, thoughts, primal urges. It's also not the things you're experiencing right now. It's this other dimension of consciousness that is not, in the center of your focus, but is also not buried below it. It's sort of like hovering above.
Okay. That makes sense.
Superconscious. Yeah, I'll make it a little clearer. The superconsciousness includes clairvoyant or psychic ability, often implied in the telepathic hallucinations discussed in the two volumes. It also includes what Myers calls a phantasmic correlate, which can be projected, particularly by dying people. This phantasmic correlate is essentially the same as what we might otherwise call an astral spirit or double. For Myers, the correlate is by no means material, but entirely psychic, projected from the subjective superconsciousness of an agent to the subjective experience of the percipients. It does not necessarily, occupy any kind of objective reality. The agent projects his or her psychic being or correlate out into the world where it can be perceived by certain individuals. So you've got a little ghost that you can send out into the world.
We've all got little ghosts that we can send.
Yeah, so says Myers. Gurney would not be on board with this. This is Myers' ideas. Gurney was, not closed off to it, but he wasn't convinced. But Myers thinks this makes the most sense. We send our little ghost out, and that's what people perceive. It does sort of hover in space in a way. It's just not a physical thing.
Okay, that could be taken so many different ways, I think, depending on people's beliefs.
There's a lot you could do with it, yeah, for sure. For Myers, there's something that we can project out.
Right.
I think you said this. You might have said this earlier in the episode, but these instances only happen when, like, on the brink of death, like as they're dying, or have.
Well, possibly. I mean, in the case of that 17th century guy, he was just sort of shocked by the strange phantom. He wasn't necessarily, dying or on the point of dying, but then his wife had the same experience. So it's just these strange moments.
So does that mean people can communicate with people who are dead? I mean, I know that's a whole other thing.
We'll save that for the end. We'll see if you think it's possible based on Myers' theory here.
Okay.
The collective encounter with the phantasm best illustrates Myers' idea. He says, I treat the respective hallucinations of each member of the affected group as each and all directly generated by a conception in a distant mind, a conception which presents itself to that mind as though its center of activity were translated to the scene where the group are sitting, and which presents itself to each member of that group as though their hallucinations did not come to them incoherently or independently, but were diffused from a radiant point or phantasmogenetic focus corresponding with that region of space where the distant agent conceives himself to be exercising his supernormality or supernormal. So he's saying that, this group is looking at a point in space where this thing, this little ghost, is hovering. And they're all having their own subjective experience of the little ghost. Remember the ice cream, the silks, whatever? Mm-hmm. But there it is. It is there for all of them, and they can see it. It has a kind of objective reality. If Myers' psychic doppelganger is the best possible explanation for collective phenomena, then it opens the possibility that this phantasmic correlate is also the best possible explanation for the reciprocal and singular encounters of the phantasms of the living as well. Myers opens his essay worrying about the problem of ghost clothes. That's right, ghost clothing.
He's worried about ghost clothes.
We should all be kind of, logically, if there were such a thing as a ghost with an objective materiality in the world, what exactly is the manner of ectoplasm that makes up their pants? It's ridiculous to think that ghosts can form or make their own clothes, and yet so many ghosts are reported wearing the clothing that they wore in life or draped in flowing translucent robes. Think about this, Anna. You have a spirit, right? Theoretically. Mm-hmm. I mean, a ghost idea is that there is a spirit in your body. Maybe it's even shaped like your body. But your pants don't have a spirit.
My pants have a spirit.
You see what I'm saying, though?
Yeah, I do.
We can take our clothes on and off, even if we say that our spirit shapes itself to our body in some way. It doesn't shape itself to our pants. Our pants don't even stay on us that long. So ghost clothes.
So what you're saying is that it's the person who's seeing it, they just kind of make up the clothes in their brain?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
The problem doesn't exist if the ghost is actually a psychic entity impressing itself on the superconsciousness of person, who then conjure the image of the ghost as a hallucination rather than seeing it in space. So that's why I've been really careful about the word hallucination. When you see my little ghost, it's really there with you, says Myers. It's really in the room, and we know from these cases of multiple people seeing the little ghost that they're all seeing it. But your individual consciousness is going to hallucinate onto my little ghost whatever pants you want me to wear. There are no ghost pants.
That makes sense.
Right.
It's like everything we see is kind of what we make up. That didn't make sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay.
But I, as the projector of the little ghost, also have some agency here. The phantasm impresses the mind to view it as it chooses to be viewed and is filtered through the percipient's own subjectivity. In fact, the agent's psychic double collaborates with the mind of the percipient in forming the phantasm that the percipient ends up seeing. For this reason, drowning men are often seen as wet. Back to Anna in the pool. The agent sends the impression of their death circumstances, and this is how the mind of the percipient processes it.
Okay. That makes sense to me.
Cool. All right. Although Gurney is reluctant to give us a double, Myers shows how collective cases of telepathic hallucination are perhaps better understood as engagements with real, independent psychic entities, astral doppelgangers existing beyond the physical plane, or perhaps the body is the doppelganger and the psychic projection is who, underneath, we truly are. Yeah, last thoughts, ladies.
Well, this is just reminding me of this lady I know who told me a story this past summer. I'm not going to get into like super specifics because it's not my story, but she basically was a young single lady and would go into this man's, this sounds way worse than it's going to be, this man's store, and they would talk all the time and blah, blah, blah. And one night she went to bed and she woke up in the middle of the night and he was sitting at the foot of the bed and like talking to her, and he was like, don't worry, you're going to end up with, and gave her this like, I don't know if I should say exactly what it was because kind of personal, but basically it basically told her that she was going to end up with this man, and she didn't know. He had a nickname. We'll say, you're going to end up with the Rose. Let's just say the Rose. And then,
okay.
And then later, then like couple days later or something, she found out that the man had died the day that he was at the foot of her bed.
Wow.
So that was...
And was his prediction correct?
Yeah. So she
ended up with the
She met
Rose?
him a couple days later, and apparently they missed each other in the store all the time. She would come in, and then she would leave, and then he would come in. And then, you know, they would always miss each other, and the guy was always like, oh, man, you guys have to meet. You love each other. And, yeah, she met him randomly, had no idea that the guy had pictured them together or anything. And they were just dating and stuff, and then one of his friends called him his nickname, the Rose, for, sake of the story. And she was like, oh my god, no way.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that just reminded me of that story.
Shannon, you want to bring us on home?
Oh, yes. I will try my best. It's been a hot minute. I hereby declare close to this lovely episode.
This meeting?
This meeting until we...
Of the Who
Sorry,
are we as a group?
It's been a hot minute.
It's good, I got you. You hereby adjourn and declare close this meeting of...
Alchemical actors until such a time we get together and do it again.
There you go, yeah, you made it.
Right.
Our voice actors today, we had a lovely group: John Cook, Sean Priest, Andrew Mims, Brandon Walls, Nikki Henderson, Luke Kinnaman, and Brie Literal. Joining me around the mic, the internet mics, we had Anna Pavon, our brand newly dubbed originator of the origin.
Thank you, Brian.
One more shout out for Brian, Instaquisitor Shannon Landers.
Bye.
And me, my name is Dr. Rob C. Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. Next time on Occult Confessions, we're going to check out ghost photographs and the phenomena, the Reichenbach phenomena, also known as auras, here on Occult Confessions.
I guess I'm gonna use this time to go to the bathroom real fast.
Okay.
or we can just talk. We could talk shit.
Yeah, we should just talk shit.
Yeah.
Roommate's a little loud.
Oh, he's
Okay.
back.
I'm back. Sorry. What, are you talking about me?
We were talking shit. And
Well, it's fine. I recorded it. I'll listen to it later.
we didn't get very far.
You're talking about my levitating?
Yeah, it wasn't that great. I've seen higher.
I was sort of leaning a little to the left.
It was a little wobbly.